Like the editors to sign.
Of course, of course. Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Martin Center for the presentation of our book, Christian Democracy, Conservatism, and the Challenge of the Extreme. So a brief word about the publication, because this is actually the fruit of a long work that started back on November 23, with 4 papers that were prepared for internal discussion by members of our academic council, including, of course, its chair, Klaus Welle. And then we decided to expand the debate, to external experts, leading academics, politicians, practitioners, who were invited to present their papers in an authors conference that we organized in March 24. And these papers, updated, revised in order to take into account also the conclusion of this conference, ended up in the book that you have on your table. And to discuss this book and the lessons that we could draw for the future of the center, right, we have the pleasure of having with us 4 of its authors. Our president, Mikuláš Dzurinda, the 2 co-editors, so Academic Council Chair Klaus Welle and Strategic Coordinator and Senior Research Officer Federico Ottavio Reho, and last but not least, Wolfram Kaiser, Professor of European Studies at the University of Portsmouth and visiting professor at the College of Europe. Thank you all for being here. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to President Dzurinda for his welcoming remarks, since he has to, unfortunately, leave us earlier.
Thank you, Sara. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the Wilfried Martin Center for European Studies. That is, as you know, political foundation, political think tank associated with the European People's Party. Look, I'm pretty sure that you know, because it is generally known that we, or the EPP, won the last 6 consecutive European elections. It is also generally known that we have the highest number of the prime ministers or the heads of state in the European Council, which is great, and we are very happy with that. At the same time, however, we realize that the number of MEPs in our group is continuously, gradually decreasing in favor of the extreme right. The last European elections gave them, I mean the extreme right, around 1/3 of the total votes, which is a remarkable result for them, I would say. That's numbers. But there is also an experience. Last week I was flying from Skopje. We had a nice political event there. I was flying from Skopje to Vienna via Frankfurt. At the Frankfurt airport, I had a very emotional discussion with one of my fellow citizens from Slovakia. And his point was very simple. He told me, sir, people are completely confused. They are disoriented. So he has a feeling that there are only 2 camps, 2 groups within our societies. Extreme left, extreme right, and these big groups are fighting each other. Nothing in between. So I can understand, because we face this phenomenon not only in Europe but also in the United States in these days. And I mean that this development endangers not only our political family, the EPP, not only the other standard political parties, but even more worrying, it is endangering also our own European project as such. So I believe it is natural that we, as a political think tank associated with the European People's Party, try to analyze why is it so, and even more to contemplate what measures need to be adopted to reverse this trend. If I am not mistaken, it was an idea of Klaus, supported by Federico, Klaus Welle, is the chairman of our academic council. Dr. Federico Ottavio Reho is a strategic coordinator of our research team to collect articles of prominent thinkers, but also political practitioners dedicated to these topics. And the result of their endeavor is here on our table. Now it is natural, this is our interest, to share our insights, the result of our analysis, but also our recommendations, not only with political actors, decision makers, or political analysts, people from academia, but also with the wider public. This is why we organize a tour of discussions. We are using many different opportunities how to share these ideas. This time around, we will hear from both masterminds of the project, from Klaus, Federico, and our guest professor Kaiser. The discussion will be moderated by our senior research officer, Sara Pini. So I'd like to thank especially Klaus for a fantastic job, Federico, many thanks and congratulations. And I am very happy that you have accepted our invitation. Thank you for coming and joining. Welcome. Enjoy the debate.
Thank you very much, President. So now, to start our panel, I would like first to give the floor to our speaker for the introductory remarks about their own contribution, but also in general about the book. So I would start with our chair of the Academic Council, Klaus Welle.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sara. Why are we doing this? We are doing this because our political order is challenged, threatened. It's challenged from the outside, Russia, China, others. And there the response has to be geopolitical and maybe defense. We've been working a lot on defense. But it's at the same time challenged from the inside by parties which are generally called on the populist right, an expression I don't like so much because we have to differentiate what is over there. But parties which claim to be Christian Democrat and conservative. So that means it's absolutely necessary that we clarify for ourselves what does it mean for us to be Christian Democrat, to be conservative, and what is the dividing line with the other ones. And we see that from the right, we now have a kind of philosophical movement, internationally coordinated, from the United States, Israel, Europe, which can be called Christian nationalism, and which calls itself Christian nationalism, and believes that nationalism is Christian. We have some difficulties because if Christianity would have been nationalist, they probably would have stayed in Palestine, But they thought we have to go out to the world and, let's say, be an offer to everybody. So that needs a clarification. What is our programmatic base? So what is Christian democracy? What is conservatism? Maybe also in how far are we liberal? My position has been for a very long time that when you look at Christian Democrat concepts, subsidiarity, personalism, federalism, social market economy, People's Party, Party of the Center, what do they all have in common? They all have in common that they are all ideas of reconciliation in society, between freedom and responsibility, between different levels, between the market's efficiency and then correction. All Christian Democrat concepts are concepts of reconciliation in society. Also, the idea of Party of the Center is an idea. The idea of People's Party is an idea of reconciliation in society. And conservatism, if we take it by the most fundamental, we could say conservatives try to preserve. And I think it's even correct if we look back even to the 19th century. Normally they try to preserve the current political order. So conservatism, for me, in that sense, I'm a conservative, try to preserve the order as established after 1945, where European integration is a fundamental part, as transatlantic cooperation, as social market economy. So what is then the populist right? The populist right is driven by the revolt of the lower middle class. When you look at electoral data, AfD, FPÖ, or also in France, Le Pen, you always have the same picture. You have workers overrepresented, you have unemployed overrepresented, you have relatively low formal education overrepresented, and you have overrepresented those who have a below than average income. So that's sociologically the voters. Not everybody, but that's where they are overrepresented. So we have the revolt of the lower middle class, and they are revolting against what? From my point of view, we see a backlash, a nationalist backlash against the second globalization. First globalization was at the end of the 19th century, and it didn't end up very nicely. It ended up in the First World War, which was basically globalization in the sense of exporting goods. The second globalization, started maybe 40 years ago, is exporting capital, production, and people. And what we see in the United States right now is an attempt to reverse the second globalization. That means get the people out, 10 million Harvard students, reverse capital flows, and reverse production back from outside the country back into the United States. So we have a nationalist backlash against second globalization, and the lower middle class are those which profited the least. For them, migration is social competition for housing, for social hands-out, and depressing salaries. For the upper middle class, migration is the promise of care in old age, of services which can be provided to them, but they are not directly competing. So maybe that's sufficient as an introduction. We will then later go more deeply into the topics.
Yeah, thank you very much. As usual, you're always so complete that it's difficult to find a follow-up question. You already answered everything. But Federico?
Yeah. So I would say, first of all, welcome and glad to be here with you all. I am not going to speak as a co-editor because, as you said, it does it much better than me presenting the overall argument of the book. I also cannot present my individual chapter because it would be longer than the time I have. But maybe just to say what inspired it somehow, what was the intention behind it. I think in the book and also in the structure of the book, we tend to treat Christian democracy and conservatism as distinct ideologies, which they are historically. We are right to do so. But my attempt was to identify whether there is not an area of overlap historically between Christian democracy and conservatism that gives us some sense of how a kind of doctrinal synthesis between Christian democracy and conservatism can look like. And I think the closest area of overlap is in what I have called Catholic conservatism. So my chapter is an attempt to reflect on how we can find elements for a convergence between Christian democracy and conservatism in the Catholic conservative tradition. I think that this is not an entirely abstract exercise. I mean, as you know, there was a joint group in the European Parliament between conservatives and Christian Democrats for a while. I mean, Klaus, you were already you were involved somehow in that exercise, so you remember that well. It has failed for many reasons. Probably it had to fail. There was no way to keep it alive. But my impression has always been that one of the limits of that experiment was that was never an attempt to find a doctrinal synthesis between the two sides. That this was a political exercise at the level of parliamentary groups, but that there was never an effort to go in that direction. Now, maybe the other thing that I would mention is what is the basic problem that I think part of what you raised confronts us with. And it's a problem that I have noticed ever since I came to Brussels about a decade ago. It's a strange estrangement or perhaps even a divorce that seemed to be taking place back then, and I think is still ongoing, between Europeanism and conservatism. I mean, conservatism, you mentioned it, was increasingly radicalizing in a Eurosceptic nationalist dimension. It was the period in which the British conservatives were renegotiating the relationship with the European Union, and then they called a Brexit referendum. And then a few years later, we had this strange new synthesis, doctrinal synthesis, which is national conservatism. I think the first proposal of that term, which would have seemed an oxymoron to I think previous generations of conservatives, was 2018. So what puzzled me is that historically Europeanism and conservatism were very strongly related, but that there was an ongoing divorce, and this seemed to me, first of all, intellectually puzzling, and also politically dangerous. Let me say a few words on both dimensions, and then I will stop. It is intellectually puzzling because, as I have said, in many ways, conservatives were the original Europeanists. Nationalism is one of the most revolutionary ideologies in the history of the West. It has completely dislocated both the international order and the internal order of Europe. It has been instrumental to government centralizations, the undermining of the competences of the Catholic Church, for example, in the 19th century. This is the reason why many early Christian Democrats were against these trends. It came out of the French Revolution, so precisely the trends that the early conservatives were fighting against, and it is not easy to dig out from the earliest generations of conservative, even from Edmund Burke itself, which is usually considered the father of conservatism. There are treasures of quotes and analysis in which early conservative thinkers reject nationalism. If you fast forward, I will not quote the Christian Democratic founding fathers of Europe because everybody knows that, but lesser known episode, let's not forget that the first proposal for an integrated European, supranational European order is not Spinelli's proposal in 1941, which came out of a kind of left-wing socialist tradition. It is Kudanov's-Kalergi's proposal in 1923 already, right after the First World War, for a European confederation, Pan-Europa. And this came squarely out of a conservative Central European, you could say aristocratic tradition. Even things that are normally not usually associated with conservatism, the European Convention on Human Rights, which today has become, especially in the British context, a kind of boogeyman of many British conservatives. There is wonderful literature. There is a book that I like to quote, published some time ago, a decade ago, with Oxford University Press on the conservative human rights revolution, which shows how the European Convention on Human Rights is essentially a partly conservative project, strongly supported by Winston Churchill, the result of a convergence between conservatives at the national level who saw basic freedom threatened by leftists coming to powers, gaining majorities in countries like England, Clement Attlee after the Second World War and the nationalization, so let's protect property rights at the supranational level in the European Convention on Human Rights, or the French Catholic right scared that the new secularist majorities in France would undermine the independence of Catholic schools and so on. So all this, so just to say that I think that there is something intellectually puzzling in this divorce between conservatism and Europeanism that is taking place that should worry us. And there is also something, of course, politically dangerous, because the tendency that we have seen means that there is a strange conglomeration, a strange alliance forming between parts of the conservative movement and the radical right, which lends legitimacy, respectability, and strength to forces that are historically not part of the mainstream conservative movement. So that should worry us as well. So I think one of the challenges that we are facing, and if the book can contribute a little bit to at least placing the challenge on the table, is that we need to find a way to reincorporate as much as possible of the conservative movement within the European mainstream, keep it linked with the mainstream, let's say, center-right, and so give the possibility of being a conservative and the Europeanist at the same time. And this goes a bit in the direction of what you were saying of distinguishing what's there on the right. Not every force on the right is a threat. Some of them have become disenchanted with European integration, but they can be engaged with it if their conservative, I think, proposals and preferences have a right of existence within the European order and are not forced outside of it. I'll stop here for the moment. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here today. Germans, if their name is not Klaus Welle, always start with an excuse, which in my case is I'm just a historian. So I don't have any solutions for you. I just have some observations and a little bit of analysis and critical questions to you as well. Of course, I'm affected as a citizen, but not as someone who's a professional stake in the future of the EPP. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about the challenge of the extremes. In my view, and building and and connecting to what Klaus has already said, there are three. One is a rapid societal change, which is creating insecurities that Klaus has already mentioned. There are different elements to this, of course, technological change, currently including artificial intelligence, economic changes to do with global capital allocation, particularly, and social, particularly migration, but also there are other dimensions of this. And I think what all of this has led to is a widespread feeling, I think beyond the lower middle classes, not limited to the lower middle classes, of socioeconomic dislocation, a lack of stability in terms of people's private lives, and the closure of social groups combined with declining social mobility. Then secondly, I also think there is an individual, in many cases, and also collective identity crisis, which is connected to the rise of nationalism. So feelings of insecurity, fears of generational and collective socioeconomic decline. In other words, our children can only have it worse, which is very different from the post-war situation. A loss of sense of belonging in apparently atomized and to some extent really atomized societies. And this is spilled over into exclusionary identity definitions and a renewed rise of ethnically defined forms of nationalism. And the third point would be, in my view, populism as politics of mobilizing against the elites, in inverted commas. And I think it would be sensible for a political group like the EPP not to discard this completely, because of course it's clear that people who belong to elites are part of the populist movement and are abusing this. But I also think that they are asking critical questions that you need to confront. So one important dimension of this, in my view, is the professionalization of politics. Career paths in politics nowadays more or less exclusively take place in politics and political institutions. People who go through this kind of system, if you like, become disconnected from the everyday lives of fellow citizens, and not just in Brussels, but also in national capitals, and are increasingly unable, or at least citizens regard them as unable, to speak about politics in authentic and accessible language. And I think that's a widespread actual problem, not just an allegation. And then secondly, also a degree of malfunctioning of democratic institutions, excessive control, in my view, by political parties and groups over institutions, filling of posts for themselves, etc., which has created the impression of a self-serving class of politicians and officials who are not interested in the common good anymore. And I think that is also something where the EPP may be, in terms of how it treats the European Parliament, needs to be a little bit more self-critical in terms of how these institutions are transforming under the influence of political parties and political groups, and whether that's not in turn undermining the future of these center-left and center-right political parties and groups. Now, I've also been asked very briefly to talk about the reasons for the success of Christian democracy, because I've worked a lot on transnational party cooperation among Christian Democrats in post-war Europe and on the history of the EPP group, particularly in the first 40 years of its existence, CD group and EPP group in the European Parliament, to talk about the success of Christian democracy in the post-war period. And I would just like to highlight, instead of focusing on Christian democracy itself, the beneficial structural conditions under which Christian democracy was able to be so successful in the post-war period, and these have significantly changed and create challenges, in my view, for Christian democracy or for the EPP political party and group. The first one is conditional support by the Christian Democrats for the development of national welfare systems with European extensions. The European extensions were important from the very beginning in coal and steel, and particularly through the common agricultural policy to provide some security for the rural farming communities. So this then resulted in the promise for citizens of a caring state and more than minimal social protection, to some extent embedded, of course, in Catholic social teaching. And then this was also connected to the promise of social mobility through educational attainment. And all of this, of course, facilitated greatly by these 30 years, glorious 30 years of almost continuous growth and narrowing wealth and income gaps. The second point, nationalism, was completely discredited after 1945, and the Christian Democrats were unequivocally committed to what I would call Europeanism and European integration and institutionalization to find common solutions for common problems. So national political traditions of nationalism were, of course, very different. There was nationalist Protestantism in Germany, for example, nationalist far-right Catholicism in France, Action Française in the interwar period, and also, to some extent, the Catholic Church's hierarchies, collusion with fascist regimes, which also helped to discredit nationalism as well, and authoritarian and far-right regimes. So this then resulted in the strong need for cooperation and European integration, importantly as a win-win solution, and not as a zero-sum game as it's often treated nowadays in negotiations in the European Council or the Council of Europe particularly. And the last point I want to make is that also Christian democratic political elites, I think, were seen as credible, as running politics and institutions in an equitable and efficient manner. So they were socially mixed in terms of their internal composition, including representatives of what you could call the working class and Christian democratic trade unions, which is no longer the case nowadays. There was still a possibility of what you call in German Quereinstieg, so the possibility for different entry points into politics from a variety of professional careers and at different stages, which guaranteed this socially mixed political elite. And finally, the institutions were functioning with a high emphasis on competence and expertise in the selection process. And I think all of these dimensions contributed to the credibility of Christian democracy as a political movement, and also their rule or dominant role in continental European politics in Western Europe as political parties in the post-war period. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the three of you for these very complete and also complementary contributions and introduction. So now let's dig a bit deeper on the points that you have raised, starting with Klaus. You already told what are the extreme and what is the origin. What is actually the challenge that they represent for us? Why are we so interested in developing this?
I mean, for the political family, the challenge is obvious. It's a competitor, but the question is, what is the challenge for society? When you have a look at the political landscape, you can divide parties up on an economic axis between state intervention and market, but also on a cultural axis between, you could say, in the extreme, multiculturalism and nativism. And then parties find their specific spots. And when we ask who are the extremes, then yes, we have the very left on economics, very statist, and let's say we have some who are very much on the right, but the populist right is not so right on economics. It's not so different from the EPP. The real difference is on culture. And my thesis is we have an ongoing cultural revolution on the left, which is the emptying out of traditional concepts. Emptying out of traditional concepts like nation, border, gender, for example. And it's ongoing, and it's still there and wants to go further. And we have what I would call the cultural counter-revolution on the populist right, which tries to restore, which tries to go back, not to preserve, but to go back to, let's say, a situation which was maybe there 30, 40 years ago. And the EPP is in the center. So the EPP is the only political force in Europe which is not part of the culture wars, neither of the cultural revolution on the left, nor of the cultural counter-revolution on the right. But what we have to our right is divided. They are, for a reason, in three different groups. And therefore, we cannot just look at them as one block. Let's not forget that the German AfD was too radical for Marine Le Pen. So Marine Le Pen kicked them out and said they are not acceptable for us. Why? Because we are not supporting remigration as an idea. That means people who are established in the country should be kicked out again. And then we have the Patriots, which obviously, at least Marine Le Pen and Viktor Orban, were too radical for Giorgia Meloni. Because there was the offer to form one group, and Giorgia Meloni, I think, did everything that it didn't happen. You know, if you take in the Nice at the good time, you probably will not get Marine Le Pen. If you take in Romanians who hate Hungarians, you are not under the threat to have the Orban party itself. So there are three different identities. The last two groups are especially divided on their position towards Russia. ECR is transatlanticist. The Orban group, let's say, has some understanding for Viktor Putin, for Vladimir Putin. Sorry. I won't claim copyright on that. Has some understanding for Vladimir Putin, sometimes even a little bit more. So there are reasons why they are divided. It's not one family. And when you look at it from the point of view of the system, then you have those who try to undermine or destroy the system in terms of European integration, maybe also in terms of rule of law. And you have those who don't, but maybe have different views on culture, like abortion or LGBTQ+. And that's, for me, the most important differentiation is between the constructive right, that's engaging constructively in policy processes, like, for example, finding solutions on migration, which Giorgia Meloni did, and the ODS did, and NVA did, and the destructive right, which is not engaging in finding practical solutions, but is rather positioning itself as system opposition.
Thank you. Actually, the challenge of the extreme was not in the original title, the one that we gave to the authors conference, that was titled Beyond Center Right, Christian Democracy and Conservatism for the 21st Century. But then when we received the contribution, and also during the debates, during the conference, we realized that there was really this common thread in most of the contributions. So it naturally made its way into the book. And it also clarifies the goal of the book, because it's not just, let's say, an academic theoretical exercise of analysis of ideologies from the past, but a concrete reflection on how they can still help today confront the issues of today. So, Professor Kaiser, you already said why Christian democracy was so popular after Second World War II, but is this tradition still politically relevant today, and can it provide the tools to tackle this challenge of the extremes?
Yeah, well, I think what was really important was Klaus Welle's remark about the ability of Christian democracy in the post-war period to reconcile different dimensions of society, different social groups, different political ideas. And I think that's something, this form of moderation is something that is essential if we want to overcome these societal and political divisions and fragmentation that we are experiencing nowadays. So that's at the most general level, I think, is an experience that we can learn from in terms of the post-war period and what it means for us today. And then I think it's also important to understand that there are other challenges, especially in terms of the what I call in my contribution to the book, the German model, which has influenced EPP policy, not least via Klaus Welle, of course, and the expansion of the EPP from the original Christian Democratic core in order to encompass conservative political parties as well. There are challenges now for this German, if you like, model in terms of the CDU and CSU, of combining left Catholic conservative and liberal conservative traditions. And I think these have to do, and that's something that I would like to highlight, with the re-emergence of national political traditions that demonstrate that we have only a limited form of Europeanization of political cultures, I think, in the European Union or more generally in Europe nowadays, of national political traditions that we thought had perhaps disappeared through these processes of Europeanization. But in fact, I think in some cases extend back to the 19th century or the interwar period, and that are still virulent and re-emerging and creating challenges, I think, not just for the EPP, but for our democratic political systems more generally. And I would just like to give you 3 examples for this. So the Hungarian case of Viktor Orban, there are some particularities there, but of course, the nationalism of Orban goes back to the second half of the 19th century and the period after 1848. Also in terms of its extraterritorial reach to cover all Hungarian speakers who live anywhere, including in the Ukraine, etc. That's completely not new. That's something that's 150 years old and it's just coming up again and now creating problems. Or the far-right political Catholicism in France, which is combined, as you've rightly said, with a kind of statist or mercantilist economic policy, which actually goes back to the 18th century in terms of the economic policy preferences, and to the Action Française and the Boulangisme and so on in France in the interwar period in the 19th century. So these are traditions that are to some extent particularly French on the far right, and they are re-emerging through Le Pen's political movement and political party. And similarly, when you look at the AfD in the German context, of course, there are traditions of Protestant extreme nationalism in Germany, which also go back to the 19th century, which in the interwar period were represented largely by the German National People's Party, for example, which are again coming to the fore. So I think maybe the EPP collectively has been, as many academics, including perhaps myself, deluded itself for too long that through these processes of effective Europeanization, these national political cultural traditions have been overcome. And that's not really the case. And I think we need to look at this critically and think, well, how can we respond to this?
Okay, thank you. And Federico, basically the same question, but about conservatism. How can conservatism take back its original, what you call this original identity, and reject these extremist tendencies?
Maybe I would make a premise, which is generally about the relevance of political ideologies in democracies. Political ideologies of both the right and the left, and particularly the center right and the center left. We come from a period, I mean, a kind of end of history frame of mind was a little bit also a kind of end of ideologies frame of mind. And I always felt that that was potentially a threat to democracy, because democracy requires a multiplicity of traditions, organized political parties based on grand ideological narratives, competing based on different conceptions of the common good. People must have a differentiation of choices. If they don't, then you risk one of the 2 evils that we have faced in the last decades, one of them being technocracy, the TINA argument, the experts know and there is no alternative and that's all we can do. And even if you vote out the previous ones, the next ones will be constrained to do the same things. So that's a risk, I think, a democratic risk. And it's a vice that has been more typically, I think, that has infected more the kind of center of the political spectrum than the fringes. Or populism is the other tendency to say, no, I mean, we don't have, it's elites versus people. And these 2 tendencies are fundamentally liberal, I think, both of them. They undermine, I think, the competition between alternative political traditions that is essential to democracy. So in this sense, both Christian democracy, conservatism, and they have to remain relevant. They have to be updated, but to be relevant in order for our democracy to function. We cannot do without them. I think that in conservatism, you find a bit similarly to what Klaus and Wolfram said about Christian democracy. You can find a strand of moderate, mainstream establishment conservatism, which is about pragmatic adaptation to historical circumstances. It's about privileging historical continuity and evolution based on tried institutions instead of major revolutionary upheavals. It is about organic growth as opposed to radical rupture. So in this sense, there is an antidote to the trends that we are seeing on the right. But also we need to be very honest. I mean, as you were saying, as Wolfram was saying, throughout the history of Western ideologies and political movements, there have always been on the conservative right also more radical, different ideologies. They have always been there. I mean, one of them is reactionary conservatism. A very, in some ways, I mean, you could even say a glorious ideology because it has made important contribution to political thought. From Joseph de Maistre to Carl Schmitt in the 20th century. I mean, you don't need to agree with them, but these are thinkers of a certain, interest from the point of view of the history of ideas. But when it becomes politically engaged and dominant, it's problematic. Another kind of element of the right that is re-emerging is revolutionary conservatism, what some students of the interwar German context call revolutionary conservatism. In my opinion, I mean, even more than the evangelical nationalism that you were speaking of, Wolfram, I see a lot of echoes of revolutionary conservatism, what is called the European New Right. I mean, people like Alain de Benoit in France, I mean, these people are directly reading interwar revolutionary conservative, mostly German literature, and they are drawing inspiration, they are updating it to rethink the role of a modern right. So this is not, I don't think that they are neo-fascists in this sense. I disagree with the left tendency to treat every radical right movements as a fascist phenomenology. Because even in the interwar period, revolutionary conservatives were not fascists. They were contiguous. They were supportive of authoritarian fascist regimes in many member states, but they are intellectually distinct from them. And so I think it is important. One of the nice things of this book is that it gives us, at a relatively practical level, in between academia and active politics, it gives us the chance of starting to re-engage with some of the traditions that are shaping the underwood somehow of or ideological underwood of this movement, and which are not really very well understood. But we must be aware that these are almost permanent fixture of Western, the Western ideological and political landscape, and that each generation of establishment conservative has to make a judgment call on what forces are we facing to our right, how do we differentiate between them. In some context, it might be expedient to cooperate with at least some of them. In some context, a strategy of direct and radical confrontation is to be preferred, but there is nothing new under the sun. That's something that we should be aware of.
Thanks, Federico. Now, Klaus, you said in your introduction that this whole exercise, the purpose of this, is to reflect on who we are and what tells us apart from others. In several of your papers, not just here, you call this the challenge that we are facing, the political identity theft operated by the extreme right to the detriment of the EPP. So how can the EPP claim this identity back?
Yeah, I think it's time a little bit to go back to basics. Huh? And even, we had a presentation also at the EPP Congress, and Federico asked me, what is Christian about Christian democracy? So these are very fundamental questions. These two are not the same. They cannot be confused. But what is Christian about Christian democracy? And one thing for me is clear. Christian is never hate. Christian and hate doesn't go together. I mean, if something is Christian, then it's love, let's say, in a specific sense. And Christian is also meant for everybody around the world. It can never be nationalist. So these are maybe simple things, but they are not clear for Christian nationalists. So we can never be on the side of hate, and we cannot be on the side of nationalism, which is a variant of hate, because we are something better. We are something better than the other one. And the second thing is simply problem solving. you know, this 1/3 of which I've been speaking about, they are not convinced that their problems are solved. And if I can take a simple example, when I started in politics, I had a colleague who was also very active in politics. He was delivering the post, employed by the German state. The job was done at lunchtime. In the afternoon, he was doing politics, or he was having coffee and cake with his wife, and altogether it was a decent life. If I compare this with the guy who is now throwing my Amazon package, I don't buy a lot of his Amazon, but let's say the Amazon deliverer who doesn't have 30 seconds to deliver the package, who has to throw it because he's so much under pressure. So we see that basically the same job has completely changed within one generation. So we need to have more interest and find also solutions for those people who have not been profiting from globalization and who are under increased competition, and look at immigration also as something which cannot be to the detriment of the poorer and the weaker in society, and which therefore has to have certain limits. So migration has to be an important point. How do we get back to growth? Germany, 3 years no growth. Italy, until very recently, 20 years no growth. 20 years no growth. The party political landscape is completely changing. So if we are not delivering, we shouldn't be surprised. So we need concepts on migration, which have to be stricter than currently, and look at what societies can tolerate. We have to find a new path to growth, and of course we need to defend ourselves.
Thank you. Professor, beside these external challenges, in your paper, you identify also internal challenges, I mean, internal to the EPP. And you say that, and I quote you, that this could spell the end of the CDU, CSU dominated transnational political empire, so the EPP. What are the most pressing of these challenges, and what would you suggest as an external observer to the EPP?
Well, as I've said, I'm not going to suggest solutions, but I think there has been a fundamental problem in the post-Cold War period for the EPP, which was that I think the EPP collectively, actors at the national level and at the European level, saw the end of the Cold War as a kind of end of history, to misquote Francis Fukuyama, who was also thinking about the European Union having won the Cold War rather than the United States or the West more generally, and explained that later. Because apparently the end of the Cold War corroborated all of the things that the EPP was standing for: Western parliamentary democracy, European integration, mixed market economy, etc. So I think the EPP then became too focused, would be my argument as a historian, on expanding its power base, incorporating new political parties, especially, of course, in East Central and Southeastern European countries, and becoming the strongest group in the European Parliament, which is why we're talking here. So I'm making that point, or of course in the European Council and the Council of Ministers as well, in order to have the greatest possible power and influence in the institutional context of the European Union. But it didn't any longer ask itself, and you're asking these questions now, and I think that's very, very helpful. Why is it that we want to exercise power and influence? And I think this void in terms of your political and policy visions, if you like, for the European Union and member states and citizens is something that has created a situation, that's my most general point because I want to leave time for the discussion as well, has created a situation where the EPP at the European level in the European Union, in my view, is in a similarly dangerous situation as the Conservative Party in the UK, where I happen to be based and work. Because the Conservative Party in the UK has always thought of itself as the natural party of government, and never thought about why it's even there to govern. It's better at governing than others, and that's a sufficient legitimation. But I wonder whether for the EPP in the European Union context that's sufficient nowadays, and I think it's necessary to devote far more time and energy to the question of why are we governing. And so I think this kind of context here in the work of the Martens Institute is very helpful in terms of making progress along this road of answering these questions that Klaus has also raised a minute ago.
Thank you. And actually, Federico, this idea of political identity theft, it's a bit the Klaus speaks about in his papers. It's something that you also kind of explore. You already spoke about it a little bit, but let's develop a little bit. This idea of Catholic conservatism being sort of hijacked by national conservatism and away from Christian democracy, where that would it be its natural house. So Klaus already told what is Christian in Christian democracy. What do you think is Christian in Christian democracy, and what is not Democrat in the Christianity as it is intended by the extreme right?
I think part of the answer is indeed. I think I agree with Klaus. I mean, Klaus put it almost as half a joke, right? That Christ was a universalist, not a nationalist, not a Palestinian nationalist. But in reality, I mean, if we go back to the origins of Christianity, we should not forget that this issue of whether Christianity was a Jewish sect or whether it was a new universalist religion was present in the early decades of the Christian faith, and it was only really settled in St. Paul's letters, in reality, in favor of the universalist break. And so, in this sense, I think you are absolutely correct that one of the key innovation of Christianity was to break away from the religion of the alliance between the elected people and the single God. And I don't think fasting forward a little bit recklessly to our own time, I don't think it is by chance that some of the key theoreticians of national conservatism, Iora Mazzoni, is actually an Orthodox Jew. I mean, based between Washington and Jerusalem, trained as a biblical scholar, an Old Testament scholar, and a lot of his thinking on national conservatism comes out of an Old Testament reading, I think, of which comes natural to a right-wing Jew, probably, but it is rather alien to the mainstream tradition of the Catholic Church. And I also agree with Wolfram that the evangelical influences, and therefore, I mean, nationalist. We know that Protestantism was one of the other key vehicles in the spread of nationalism in the history of the West. And so I see a lot of evangelical influences, for example, in pockets of the MAGA Catholics in the United States. But if I have to be completely honest, I'm not sure that if we want to address the problem honestly, I don't think we can't just dismiss this by saying, oh, they are bad Catholics. And of course, I mean, they reduce Christianity to an identitarian symbol, and they reduce the cross to a symbol of national identity, and that is wrong. And I think that the problem was that part of the Catholic conservative right, which was not inherently Eurosceptic, felt rightly or wrongly that their especially anthropologically conservative views could not adequately be represented anymore within the mainstream center right. For the reasons, I mean, partly it's reflected also in what Klaus said, right? That the mainstream Christian democratic parties have become kind of culturally agnostic. I mean, culture is not such an important central part. I mean, in conservatism, as you have defined it, there is almost nothing substantive, in fact, in cultural. I mean, under your definition, if conservatism is about defending the established system, then the members of the Politburo of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union who were opposing the perestroika were conservatives. You see, so you need something beyond the purely contextual definition, I think, of conservatism, and more substantively conservative, culturally conservative, to attract the parts of the religious right and the Catholic conservative right that have moved away from Christian democracy and gravitated towards national conservatism. I think there are ways of doing that. I totally agree that we should never engage in culture wars. Culture wars are not the solution. But I think that there are ways of doing that enable us to send a signal to these constituencies without engaging in culture wars. For example, I have always said, I mean, when a morally contentious issues come to the agenda of the European Parliament, the line, it has always been in the EPP, freedom of conscience. But the result of that is that with the votes of the centrist wing of the EPP, positions that Catholic conservatives consider rightly or wrongly abhorrent are de facto approved. And so you get resolutions of the European Parliament, which is not legally binding, but then the Court of Justice starts quoting them in the legal background, and so on and so forth. I think it would be much more productive for the EPP not to even open the discussion and to take a stance on subsidiarity ground. These matters are no EU competence. We should not enlarge Article 2 to the point of encompassing whatever the most progressive definition of rights. The EPP could say, some of us agree, some of us disagree. We don't engage in culture wars, but we vote against on subsidiarity ground, on constitutional ground. I think this would be probably a way to re-engage part of these people who feel that anyway, they are going to vote with the left on all these matters without taking the fatal step that Klaus rightly warned against, which is engaging in culture wars and then reducing Christianity to an identitarian symbol and going to political rallies with the crosses and rosaries, which would have, I think, horrified, the Christian democratic founding fathers of Europe.
Yet, actually, this idea of subsidiarity is one of the main tenets of your idea of the new Europeanism. You briefly spoke about it at the beginning, the idea that the Europeanism is not just Spinelli. Can you just very briefly, because we have to give you credit, Federico is our Cassandra. He has been speaking about this for forever, but now this idea clearly resonates.
Look, as I said at the beginning, I arrived 10 years ago. What was coming was not difficult to see for those who were acquainted with the situation, the thinking, and the movements of the conservative right. It was clear that something was changing. And the perception was back then, for good reasons, because I think the reflex of the EPP during the crisis, the poly crisis, the migration crisis and the financial and euro crisis, it was to retrench with the European mainstream to protect the European project, because the European project was threatened existentially by the rise of the new forces on the right. I think that was the correct reflex, but the kind of collateral damage of that was the perception that there was basically no distinction between the center right and the center left, that the real divide was no longer between, as I said at the beginning, different visions of the future of Europe competing within the European project with each other, but the divide was you could be pro-EU or anti-EU. So if this EU you didn't like, you were pushed in the arms of the radical right. And that was something that worried me. And that's why a lot of what I have done across the years was an attempt to reflect how can we define a kind of approach to European integration that does not renege on our Europeanist commitment, but based on our historical tradition clarifies that the Europeanism of a Christian Democrat or of a conservative is not the same as the Europeanism of a socialist. It is much more subsidiarity based, much more institutionally decentralized, much more culturally rooted, historically rooted, much more respectful of cultural diversity. Probably, we can disagree on economic policy, but back then I had proposed, which was probably what put off many people in the EPP, that it should be also more competitive and liberal, economically liberal than. But we can have different ideas, because in the Christian democratic tradition, there is a preferential option for the poor as well. There is the possibility of a European welfare state. We can disagree about these things, but I guess the essence of it is that we need to articulate a vision of the future of Europe that is specifically EPP or center-right or Christian democratic and conservative, that can appeal to broad constituencies on the Christian democratic and conservative rights, even beyond the current EPP, and that can clearly differentiate itself from that of the left. This does not mean that you cannot cooperate. Of course, you have to cooperate. We live in democracies, thank God, precisely because we prize a culture of moderation and we reject extremes and polarization. But if we don't have this possibility of differentiating the political offer and competing between different political families based on different conceptions of the common good, I think we are going to lose, and we have lost unnecessarily a lot of people along the way who just didn't like this or that aspect of the currently existing in EU, and then they felt they had no option but to support the extremes.
Yeah, thanks. Klaus, I saw you taking notes when Federico was speaking about the subsidiarity and the cultural wars. Maybe you want to add something about that?
No, I can agree with that. Very, very long time, for decades, Ireland was a completely respected member of the European Union, was having completely different abortion laws and completely different laws on marriage and divorce. And it was not a problem. And then after some time, Ireland took a different decision after internal development, and it came around. So to try to impose on those issues common rules across 440 million with completely different backgrounds, from my point of view, is wrong. Or if it is right, then it has to go to both directions. You see? Then also liberals would need to be ready to accept it the other way around, which is also not the case. So I think we are well advised for the cohesion of the European Union on those more cultural issues. Yes, to have some basic standards, of course, but not to impose one set of rules on everybody. So culture is an important part of the radicalization on the right. I've called it the cultural counter-revolution, also because those sectors in the economy, so more workers, less formally educated, less well paid, coming out of industrial society. And the value set in the industrial society is different. In the industrial society, it's about punctuality, it's about authority, it's about discipline. In our modern, let's say, service culture society, it's about creativity, it's about flexibility. So that means these people who cannot compete so well, they're at the same time devalued economically and culturally. And therefore, I think it's important that the EPP plays a moderating role in this situation of the double culture war.
Thank you very much. So a final question for Professor Kaiser before opening the floor to the question of the audience. In your paper, you speak about the role that CAS played. So Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, I don't think it needs explaining, in building networking among Christian democratic and conservative parties. As a political foundation, of course, we are very interested in this. So what do you think is our role as political foundation, in particular as the Martin Center, in building these bridges?
Well, I think the role of institutions like the Adenauer Foundation, which of course was very well endowed, like the EBAT Foundation, political foundations in Germany more generally, historically speaking, of course, these foundations could play were able to play a significant role, particularly in the transitions to democracy on the Iberian Peninsula, particularly, and then, of course, in Central Europe after 1989, 1990, and before already in the late 1980s in Latin America, which we shouldn't forget, where they also played such a significant role. But they played this significant role for, I think, two reasons. First of all, because in these countries, of course, there was a dearth of knowledge and understanding of what it meant to be part in the European context to eventually join the European Union, to Europeanize society, economy, the legal system, etc., in order to be prepared for membership of the European Union as the ultimate goal. So I think there was a provision of a lot of expertise here. And secondly, of course, there was a lack also simply of material resources in these countries that these foundations were able to provide, and that incentivized cooperation, closer cooperation, and forms of Europeanization, even though they might have been, as I've alluded to earlier, somewhat superficial in some ways. This led to forms of cooperation that were to some extent perhaps somewhat more hierarchical and vertically organized from a member state or some member states and from the EU institutions downwards in this transition period. And this is clearly completely changed. So nowadays, I think the Martens Institute at the most basic level or similar institutions need to make sure that they operate in a completely horizontal manner and that their cooperation is also non-hierarchical. I mean, I think we also need to be aware of the fact that we have to learn a lot here from others who are not even yet in the European Union, like Ukraine, for example, which will come out of the war, hopefully successfully, survive this terrible war by Russia against Ukraine, come out of the war, and will have gone through a process of societal transformation that will be enormous, with a lot of challenges and problems regarding their integration into the European Union, but also a lot of lessons learned from which we can also profit in terms of the sustainability and innovation of societal networks that are operating there in order to defend the country against the Russian threat and during the war. So I think it's very, very crucial not to think that everyone is coming to Brussels in order to learn from us and you have got all the answers, but to listen and to go out and talk to these others as well in a horizontal manner, to learn from them as well, and to have this proper dialogue rather than the center teaching the periphery, if you like, which was more the process during the democratic transitions in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe.
Thank you very much. Actually, it's a project on the pipe, the learning lesson from Ukraine, including from a point of view of societal resilience. But now I'll open the floor to the audience. So, please.
Thank you. I'm Patrick Pennings. I'm the Secretary General of the European Seniors Union. It's of course important to look to the past in order to predict the future. But also, as we say, there's nothing more difficult to predict than the future. You put in the book Europe's center-right in the context of the extremes, that is, the challenge of the extremes. But in my view, and you look at it from a philosophical perspective, but in my view, I think we also need to look at maybe a more down-to-earth perspective, which Max Weber would call the bureaucratic view of how parties develop. And what I see post-Second World War, the hegemony of the Christian democratic parties in quite a number of countries, which basically, maybe through internal sclerosis, also started to dwindle. And what we have seen recently in a number of countries is the emergence not only of extreme left and extreme right, but also of parties in the center. The parties like Macron, which became En Marche, for example, became center parties which took up quite a number of Christian Democrats, liberals, socialists in their midst. In Belgium, Flanders, you have the N-VA, the New Flemish Alternative, which is in power. You had, maybe to a lesser extent, Meloni, because she is rather right-wing, but right now, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the EPP has about five member parties in Italy, which also points at some diversity. In the Netherlands, the CDA is also dwindling, and well, I'm making it a critical perspective. The upcoming of Pieter Omtzigt, who came from the CDA actually originally, and things like that. So my point is really, is it a philosophical, cultural, religious perspective, or are we also talking about party structures and internal questioning of the parties? I think Wolfram, Professor Kaiser mentioned that before. So, and yes, this positive attitude, but it's maybe the questioning of this hegemony that has been center part, and not necessarily only the emergence of extreme left and extreme right, but also how the parties have been perceived within the different countries as maybe, and they themselves seeing as, let's say, governance or governance parties primarily, and that questioned by the population, I think. And seeing ourselves as the constructive right, yes, but that does not also apply to all parties. When for example, the second Macron government in France, the Republicans immediately state, we are in the opposition before any government is being formed. We are part of the opposition, even though a number of, let's say, policy decisions that have been taken go totally in line with a positive, constructive attitude. So, and what Wolfram also mentioned at the very end, let's also not forget that in Eastern Europe, there is very little tradition of Christian democracy. And we'll have to take that into account.
Okay, thank you. So I'll take a random question. Let's try to keep it short so that everyone can intervene. Mr. Herdia?
Thank you very much, Alexander. Earlier I was Romanian Minister of Integration, and I was Minister when the opening negotiations were decided in Helsinki in 1999. For a year as well, Ambassador Mikuláš. But I want just to ask if in the book, I didn't have the time to look if there are something about what happened in the world of today. I mean this unbelievable acceleration of the change in science and technology, which affecting terribly the fact we can't really make an analysis without taking this aspect into account. And I can develop. I'm a professor of history of science and technology. Secondly, and the main question on the political level, what happened with the Christian democratic values since 1998 when the European Christian Democratic European Union was integrated into Pini? This is for me a main question. And I want just to develop an aspect. There are a lot of aspects. In the position of the President of the European Commission, Mr. Juncker, when he spoke about the summit in Lisbon in 2008, I remember right, 2009, was the summit in Lisbon. And he spoke about the three main values, which in Christian democracy they are very clear. Freiheit, Gerechtigkeit und Solidarität. Who are these values in the speech of Juncker in 2008? He changed Gerechtigkeit, justice, with tolerance, with forgiveness. And this is absolutely unacceptable for people from Eastern Europe. And I want to ask you, what is the state of the resolution in the European Parliament, which was from 2019, a wonderful resolution, in which was said clearly that the communists has to be condemned as strong and as with the same force as was condemned the Nazis. And I want to say, I'm speaking as somebody coming from the Eastern Europe, as long as these things will not be done in Europe, the things will not develop in the right direction. We have to understand that these two catastrophes of the 20th century are of the same tragedy, and you can't start to not to take these things into account. And as well, in this resolution of 2019 of the European Parliament, a wonderful resolution, but to which the fight in the European Parliament was very long. I remember that I was there and I contributed in 2007. It was the president of Estonia which means this fight. just to have the interdiction of the former member of the KGB and political services of the Eastern countries to be candidate for the European Parliament or to take position in the structure of the European Union. There are many other things, but I stop.
Thank you very much. So briefly, Ivan, and then Yaroslav.
Thanks, Adam. Ivan Delibosic, I'll speak in the capacity of someone who had the honor to work with President Wilfred Martens and pleasure to work on his memoirs. So this comes very close to heart. Super quick comment and then a short question. Comment is about the ecumenical nature of Christianity. And whilst that is incredibly applicable to the Western Christianity, Eastern Christianity or Orthodox Christianity is nationalist. And it is relevant to keep in mind, not for the political discourse purposes, but for the impact that it had, especially on the last two wars that happened on European soil. Because that is what fed a lot of hatred, which is not inherent to Christianity. So it's just a small, and I had a long question, which I will cut super short. Mr. Welle, was it a mistake from the perspective of what you described in terms of EPP being the leading force over the past 6 mandates and the revolution and the counter-revolution taking place? Was it a mistake of being so actively involved in compromise makings in the last mandate?
Thank you very much. Jaroslav Pietras, I'm Senior Research Associate here in the Martin Center. Because after observing elections in Poland and taking part in it, I've got a number of questions why it went the way it finally gave a result. And it's relevant to the discussion here. I looked into the book. I have not read it, but I've looked into it. And I think it's kind of a searching for identity, soul searching of Christian democracy. Whereas when I look at the election in Poland, I see that the outcome was created by polarization. So because of a polarization, you force people to take positions which are not necessarily, in the center. Therefore, if you offer identity in the polarization, it might not really work. You have to look at this polarization. What happens in polarization is that when we in a title have a fight against populism, in a polarization, what your opponents do is populism, but what you do is not. Whereas opponent says exactly the same. So in a polarization, it starts to become a bit more radical views on both sides. And formerly we had a so-called median voter theorem that parties in the center were the best were addressing this median voter, and therefore everyone was trying to be attracted by this theory. What we see in the US in many places is that this polarization, radicalization, brings people apart. So my question simply is this type of search for identity a only solution, or it can be also taken apart how to operate?
Any question?
Thank you. My name is Olga Kuzmidou. My question is for Klaus Welle. He said that Christianity cannot be hate. I fully agree. He also said that for medium class people, immigration is the assurance that in their old age they will have someone to take care of. The question is, are we still a bit naive? Immigration from a different cultural and religious background sees us as enemies when they arrive here. Can we just say that we don't hate them if we see that lower people cannot accept that? Don't we that way, by ignoring this fact, give the possibility to extreme right populism to go on and on if we don't address this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So actually, we're 5 minutes late, but since we have the room available, we're not going to stop a minute, so we can leave the floor to our speakers if they want to react. I saw you both taking a lot of a lot of notes in particular, because you know. Okay, so Klaus.
Yeah, it's difficult. So the question, I mean, Olga's question is basically, is immigration culturally impossible or not? My problem is I've been trained as an economist, so I look at issues through this lens. I know it's not the only lens, but Federico always reminds me that the franchise is also important. But I think it's an important lens. As long as there's growth and economic development, these issues are manageable. The moment you become stagnant,
Yeah, you're right.
and distribution becomes difficult.
We understand that. Not everybody understands it.
On the question of polarization, I fully agree with you. This campaign in Poland was a campaign of polarization. The last campaign already as well.
Yeah.
And in fact, Donald Tusk won the campaign last time because he applied culture. He applied friend and enemy. Before Kaczynski had applied friend and enemy, and people maybe go into explanations. But last time Donald Tusk won because he had a clear friend and enemy campaign. And that's of course something which is very challenging for the center. Yeah. Because in that scenario the center disappeared. And unfortunately we see in the United States what's happening when the center is disappearing. And when two kind of radicalized versions of it. Is the problem that it's the problem, specific problem of the EPP? Personally, I don't think so, because there's the same problem in every country, nationally, in Europe and in the United States. 25% of the electorate have radicalized, and last week I was in Shanghai. It came to my mind that maybe Xi Jinping took power for similar reasons, of inequality as an outcome of accelerated globalization. It's a bit daring, but still, I wanted to share this. I agree with Alessandro's point that this specific experience of communism, you probably have to live through this. And when you haven't lived through this, it's much more difficult to understand. And, to a certain extent, Russia now is a different kind of authoritarianism.
Western Europe has to make something to understand this. And the mistake not compare Poland with Hungary. And very often Brussels said Hungarian as Poland. But in Hungary, you are right, from the point of view of what happened with the European values, the fact that the policy interfere in justice is not acceptable. But when the justice is in the hands of the former communists, like happened in Poland, must do something. And you don't can compare Hungary with Poland.
Maybe just let me add as a last point, this book was not written to solve all problems. It's maybe a starting point for a much wider engagement.
Maybe I will start. The gentleman has probably left, but I just wanted to say that the best definition of Macron that I have ever read was of Macron as a techno-populist mutant. and that was given by actually one of the co-authors of this book, Carlo Invernizzi-Accetti, but not in this book, in another publication. He wrote a book on techno-populism, in which he argues precisely that Macron is part of the problem, not part of the solution, because he has completely deconstructed the entire French political system, placing himself with this technocratic vein at the center, but it's precisely the opposite of what we need to do. And this leads me to your question on differentiation, polarization. My understanding of it is that differentiation is the antidote to polarization, is not the cause of polarization. Because only if you bring back this competition to a normal competition between a clearly differentiated center-left and center-right, then you can avoid the trap of a technocratic center versus, a populist right. So I go back to a remark that I have made across many of my previous interventions. I think this is inevitable and necessary for the functioning of democracy. But I think the Polish case, to me, raises a deeper question, which is, are culture wars at the end of the day really evitable? Can we avoid them? I have my doubts. I mean, it's interesting that you quote Carl Schmitt when it comes, who was, after all, he started as a Catholic reactionary. And one of the contributions of the reactionary thought is to argue that all cultures, all societies have a light culture. You cannot do away with it. The liberal notion that you can have a coexistence between equally different, radically different, but coexisting creeds is wrong. And reactionaries, ever since the Master, have questioned that notion. I'm not saying that I agree with them, but the experience of countries like Poland, where you have a profound shift in the light culture, from a Christian to a more liberal, post-materialist society, and the polarization that follows, I mean, it raises doubts as to whether you can really avoid culture wars when you face such massive, cultural transition. And maybe the last point on the East-West divide. I mean, I don't. It's a side remark to what you said. My impression is that the EPP remains, the last, probably the only Volkspartei at the European level. I mean, the Germans have this nice expression of a Volkspartei, which doesn't mean people's party. It means a party that is big enough to reconcile societal differences at various levels. And I think the EPP is still, because of its very wide representation, engaged in a constant effort of mediating between the North and the South, the East and the West, the small and the big member states, the conservatives and the liberals. It's not perfect, but I think it is an interesting example of that. And also my impression is that the East is changing as well. I mean, whether we like it or not. I mean, in Poland, I think PO is our most liberal party in the EPP by far, and it's a Central European party. Many parties of the EPP in Western Europe are much more right-wing than PO is. So I agree with your point. I understand your point. That experience is fundamental, but I have the feeling that it's complicated. And maybe the last point about is reference to Christianity. I thought it was very interesting that Orthodox angle that you added, indeed. And we should probably think a little bit more about that, because it's very relevant in Central and Eastern Europe in ways that we have not fully worked out, I think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience for this very interesting discussion. I don't think it needs much wrap up, because you already did it, except one thing, because one thing that emerges the need to deliver concrete solutions, not just remain at the analyzing, but deliver concrete solution to citizens, to their anguishes, to their fear, to their problems. And actually, we've thought about that. So when you go out on the table, there's a book. It's the final step of our very long time project called the 7Ds for Sustainabilities. If you haven't read it yet, I hope that most of you already have. But if you haven't, I encourage you to take a copy. Thank you very much.